Hello everyone, and welcome to Chapter 1 of Falling for Truth. Awake. So you want to wake up and go somewhere to do it. But there is nowhere to go, no place to walk to. No path will get you there. Realization is where you are right now. It is here, not there. No paths, no walking, no goals, no guides. Why? When you truly know that answer, you will be awake. 2006. The books we need are the kind that act upon us like a misfortune, that make us suffer like the death of someone we love more than ourselves, that make us feel as though we are on the verge of suicide, or lost in a forest, remote from all human habitation. A book should serve as an axe for the frozen sea within us. Franz Kafka. Chapter 1. Confession. Know myself. If I knew myself, I would run away. Goethe. I am dead. No longer a normal human. I guess that in some way makes me abnormal. But in this new way of seeing, wait, my editor interjects, looking up from reading this manuscript. You can't start a book by claiming to be dead. Why not? Well, you're obviously not dead. You're writing the book. And besides, you're sitting right there across the table from me. I purse my lip. I don't mean dead from the standpoint of the body. The body is still very much here. I meant dead from the standpoint of what I've always thought of as me, or my personality. Maybe not dead, but those things I always had total faith in, I can no longer believe in their totality. You have to explain that at the start of your book, he replies. I just did. May 28, 2005. Oh no, now we're in trouble. I whispered those words after understanding the situation confronting us. Stupidly, I got too close to the dangerous river within Johnson Canyon, just 20 yards from one of the largest natural waterfalls in Canada. Even more stupidly, I fell in. Ripped by the current, I sensed the great danger and pulled my best Johnny Weissmuller imitation to swim back to my friend Chris on the shore. This Tarzan was in desperate need of help. Upon reaching him, I did stupid thing number 2. I pulled my on-land savior into the water with me, hence uttering those words, "Oh no, now we're in trouble," as the current of water ripped me down the canyon. Time was stilled, moving millisecond by millisecond. Thought ceased. And all that arose were what I would call clusters of information, bubbles of something that were complete understanding, but not thought itself. They came up complete and full, held still as if in a painting before my eyes, and then would fade or vanish, and the next cluster would arise. What I would normally think of as my mind was not there to be found. Yet something else much deeper seemed to be working. In that microsecond came the realization, so this is how I am supposed to die. Who would have guessed it would be like this? It seemed so laughable that of all the possible ways one could die, this was the way it was going to happen to me. And it was fine. There was no great wish to continue living. I was going to die in a few seconds, and all it would be was the end of my story, and I was going to have front row seats to witness it. Pure acceptance came over me, and something that I have always known as me died. In that moment came what best I can describe as a sort of computer download. For one of the seconds, it was like a mass of data was placed inside me. It has been a long process to work through these files and find out what was in that download. The next microsecond, as the water ripped me towards the canyon wall, my head turned to gaze at Chris dog paddling to stay in place in the slower part of the current. A new thought cluster arose. Well, if I don't get out, how the hell is Chris going to get out? It was like some new force animated and took over the body, determined not to go over the falls. My right leg slammed hard into an underwater boulder, deflecting the body off course a bit towards the bank. A lucky break. My feet grazed the bottom, and I began to crawl out, all the while yelling, "Over here, it's shallow." Reaching the shore, I saw Chris already crawling out as well. He hadn't needed me. After sitting mostly quietly for an hour, we began to discuss and reconstruct the experience we both had. We were amazed with a few things. First was how perfect the experience was. Nothing could have been added to it or taken away from it to make it any better. Even the falling in was perfect. Second was how different time was in the experience. We could explain an hour of perception experience in what in relative time lasted perhaps a few seconds. Third, we had each in our own way accepted our death in the moment, with no struggling to try to extend it. And we both realized that what crawled out of the canyon was not the thing that fell in. We were new things, and we had no idea what that meant. We still don't. For 8 years previously, I was on a search for ancient Egypt's secret, studied most every tradition of spirituality and mysticism, and I thought I had found answers. Yet falling into the canyon turned everything on its head. It put my years of searching under the microscope, and showed that I had spent most of it in a veiled search of trying to get my hopes validated. Falling caused me to relook at everything. I have not been on solid footing since. In the short term, for as much as a year, a deep clarity appeared, and many delusions of the world and the spiritual community were recognized. Fear did not exist. However, there was a problem. As always, that problem is ego. A very deep realization damages ego. Thus, following any awakening, much false can be detached from, as calmness and clarity come in. But while egoic layers were damaged, they were not removed. It is amazing to see how fast the ego reorganizes itself into something different, then comes back in control with even more fear and self-importance than before. Sadly, this was the case here. The problem was, I got lazy. Any awakening is so strong, shattering, and overpowering that it is easy to think that there was nothing left to do, but be like a retired old man who just sits on his porch and watches the world go by. As Richard Rose might say, you can't just have a realization, you have to become the realization. The work has to continue, or as the Zen teachers say, when you get to the top of the mountain, keep climbing. To have a realization on any level without continued work to integrate it is likely going to lead to egoic distortions. Much of spiritual work is on the physical and psychological levels, the areas most spiritual seekers use their spirituality to avoid. Part of the work is indeed to lift to the clouds for new perspectives and understandings, but to keep one's head in the clouds permanently is not to develop any grounding. My editor, Anders, again looks up from his reading and sort of stares at me. What? I ask him. That's it? That's what? Your authority to write a book on spirituality comes from falling into a canyon? I think about the irony of that for a moment. Yeah, I guess it does, I laugh. Come on. Well, I mean, there was a decade of seeking and researching and contemplating before that. Exercises, sacrifices, tests, beautiful moments, expanding awareness. But in the end, a few microseconds of time in the canyon revealed more than all the 10 previous years of hard work combined. He shakes his head. You know, this is not what most spiritual seekers expect or really want to hear. It's not what they read in the major books. Exactly. In a sense, it was many years later when I began to realize that my experience and revelation in that canyon was genuine. I doubted it for a long time. It wasn't like anyone else's experience, nor was it the wished-for beautiful occurrence that would make me somehow more special than others. It came to me from being a careless fool, after many years of basically fooling myself that I had been a very spiritual person. Then those two fools combined, and for a split second between them, my death came, and so did a realization that I could have never expected. I mean, if someone has an experience that is exactly what they read or what they hope for, you can never be sure it is genuine, and not just a wishful projection, or a fantasy you made manifest to feel better. Really, until someone has an experience that even though perhaps having some similarities to someone else's, but still in some way unique and unexpected, they can never know for sure if it is a genuine revelation or an egoic projection. Actually, books like this are more valuable after an experience has happened, for it can help someone understand much of the confusion that comes afterwards. But what is realized in the experience itself is all beyond words, and I'm trying to spend 200 pages and over 100,000 words to help shed light on those 2 seconds after being a fool. That is why it has taken me so many years to put this manuscript together. 100,000 words about being a dead fool, Anders laughs. You know, there is a reason that the tarot fool has been given the number 0. I must confess, I rarely read introductions. I don't know why. The author spent just as much time working on the introduction, but for some reason when I start a book, I jump right into the first chapter. It makes no sense. I'm not sure what that says about me, but it did influence my reasoning to start with chapter 1. However, and with great irony I know, I thought I should introduce myself in this book. It looks like you have a spiritual book in your hands, just like any of the other thousands that are found overflowing on bookstore shelves. Spiritual writing and lecturing today is big business. Generally, they are written by people who believe they are special. Authors writing to show you how you can be more happy, successful, important, loving, unique, or in the case of religion, destined for a wonderful future once you are dead. You know, special, like the author. Some even believe they have been chosen to be a divine spokesperson or wonder healer. The spiritual book marketplace is brimming with expert after expert claiming to have all the answers. How then can we trust that any of the information out there is genuine and not just another game of delusion? Is there a way to test what someone really knows? And what reason is there for you to continue to read my book? Modern spiritual books tend to come in 2 specific formats. The first is presented from the point of view of I am the expert and is written similar to books on how to fix a transmission or grow your own vegetables. These books tend to promise that if you follow the formula being presented, usually something simple, meditate, be quiet, be in the now, think happy things, you can reach a level of perfection where you can make all of your wishes come true. How they have gained such authority to write such a book is generally vague or not convincing. The second type of spiritual writing tends to run into semi-novel form, either fictional or autobiographical. In this model, the story follows the standard format set up by Carlos Castaneda in the 1960s. The book, Beauty of the Primitive by Andrzej Znamensky, explained it as: many fictional and semi-fictional tales of power follow a certain pattern. First, the narrator-author feels over-civilized or experiences a shattering misfortune or life problem. Then the individual meets an indigenous spiritual teacher who immerses the author in the ocean of spiritual wisdom. The author-narrator embarks on a spiritual quest and goes through stages of initiation which are usually accomplished by difficult physical or moral tests, which the candidate generally passes. The end result is a total transformation of the apprentice's conscious. Eventually, the shaman spiritual teacher tells the author that she has become chosen and endowed with a certain esoteric wisdom that should be shared with the wider world. After this, the newly minted spiritual teacher-author goes into society to help solve the problems of Western civilization, which faces perpetual spiritual and ecological crisis. The authors generally claim that they are taking old practices and updating them to be used in a modern context, which is simply another way of saying that the practices are made up. They miss the key foundations of what the old ceremonies were based on: connection to the whole of manifested reality. To just make up something new and claim it has ancient lineage is, quite frankly, insulting to the wisdom holders of the last 100,000 years. Why did the authors go to so much trouble to make up a fantastic story about meeting with the so-called bringer of knowledge? It is likely because if they told the truth, no one would buy their goods. So they created a fanciful story to make themselves and what they narcissistically wish they were, a wise and important guru. In both types of books, the author claimed to be a very materialistic person before they had their encounter, but now afterward they are spiritual. However, When you examine how these people run their current lives, they seem to have become far more materialistic than they originally described, especially as they peddle workshops, CDs, DVDs, crystals, healing baths, psychic readings, and nature schools. Some even go so far as to sell ceremonies, such as sweat lodges and sun dances. And it saddens me to realize just how prevalent this is. Fairy tales sell. The bigger the promise offered, the bigger the following. Only a very few seem to write in an honest and open manner, not looking to get anything or convince anyone, but just put down some ideas on paper before they die. These are the texts and people that I hope you will seek out. I want to be clear. My book is not about me. It will not portray me as an ancient master, or list the tenets of my modern mystery school, or detail my revelations as a shaman, Tibetan monk, or Gnostic priest. It won't even necessarily portray me as a nice guy. This is the presentation of my 15-year attempt to understand the bizarre modern world by looking back to the ancients. Theirs was a past that built pyramids, which cannot be done today, by raising and placing 200-ton blocks of stone like they were Legos. Ancients who built monuments that thousands of years after their abandonment still resonate with an energy unlike anything in the modern world. A time where sacred geometry, mathematics, astronomy, and nature intermingled, creating a giant soup of knowledge, art, architecture, and daily life. However, within the remaining symbolic texts is something quite magical, something that most spirituality glosses over in a new age covering of sweet sugar. Attempting to unravel what they knew became my obsession. The ancient world, continued through various native, Eastern, and alchemical Hermetic traditions, held two key pieces of information. The first was that this world we experience is nothing but a description based on an erroneous perception, and that perception has been and is controlled and manipulated by an outside force that they described as a parasite. The world we think that is here and solid is not really here or solid at all, and that we are born, live, and die in a kind of dream world. We too are as much of a dream as the world we perceive. Secondly, that there is a doorway to move past much of this, but to reach the gate that paradoxically turns out to be gateless becomes the task of a lifetime. Their art and architecture were not there to look nice, but were to reveal their message. A spiritual vacuum exists in our modern world, which is getting more spiritual, yet more distracted and delusional. No one is really going within, just playing a game of pretend happiness, staring at their iPhone. It is the reason that I kept working on this manuscript, which began first as a series of notes 12 years ago, kept during my research on ancient civilizations. As my own experiences in these realms increased, the notes got more detailed, while more spiritual texts and teachings were seen to be misleading. Perhaps I could put down a few things in a way to help save a few seekers years of wasted effort, or at least to use my own mistakes to not fall into similar traps as I did. Each path one takes must be individual, because each person's egos, personalities, and past traumas will be packaged uniquely. People can only share what they did and what they passed on the road, with hopes that it can be useful to another. Delusion sets in when someone thinks they have a specific formula, often believed to be the only way one should walk the spiritual road. People should think less about what they ought to do and more on who they ought to become. Meister Eckhart. I have met several powerful and very direct people in my life. One was Byung-Chul Park, who we called Mr. Park, a Korean Zen teacher that I met in 1998. While Mr. Park referred to himself as a healer, he claimed that he was not interested in fixing the physical, but what he called healing the soul, to cleanse what he called darkness and poisons from our heart. Doing so would allow us to come to a place of knowing that he described as nothing but nothing. Richard Rose also claimed that miracles come when the mind is thinking of nothing but nothing. Of course, when we were studying with Mr. Park, we all tried to think of nothing, which just caused him to laugh at our foolishness. The statement is like one attributed to Socrates, whereby the word nothing is being used is not anything what our normal egoic mind believes it to be. Such statements can only be understood or entered from beyond the normal mind. I was also lucky to spend time with several native Indian medicine men. Bruce Starlight of the Tsuut'ina, Clayton Bunn of the Lakota, and Dennis McKay of the Ojibwe. I will share stories of all these people as this book continues. Several authors were extremely helpful in my seeking. Foremost are the writings by and of Richard Rose. The honesty and in fact shock of his writings felt like a gift when I came upon them after the canyon. He was about the only one out there not trying to seduce the masses with false promises so that they would give him money, prestige, and devotion. He was just saying things as he saw them, knowing most were not going to like his message. He concluded early on that his life was not worth living if he did not know who was living, why, and who dies. How could either life or death have any meaning without knowing these answers fully? He used every second of his life to search for these answers in any group, idea, or avenue he thought could be of value. The results of his search can be found in such books as Psychology of the Observer. Rose was also unique in not just being able to present this material, he lived it, totally and completely. Rose was so enticing to me in that he is the closest representation that I found to the teachings of Mr. Park. However, I find Rose much more clear and direct in his recorded lectures than his writing. Other members of the group Rose founded, the TAT Foundation, have a wealth of pointers and insight in print. The PhD thesis, The Path to Reality Through the Self, by John Kent, that overviews Rose's system, I consider the best and most accessible spiritual work published in the last 100 years. No matter the problem or challenge, a good place to start a spiritual examination is to first read the work by Kent. Other books and lectures by people like Art Tickner, Bart Marshall, or Sean Nevins may help bring the message presented by Rose into easier to understand language. My book is but an addition to these texts. I found that Rose's message was also remarkably similar to the famous Gnostic writings known as the Nag Hammadi Codex. This group was not an early Christian organization as usually presented, but more the opposite of modern religion, like a hardcore Zen or Advaita. I feel that sharing the Gnostic viewpoint throughout this book will give Western seekers an ancestral foundation in this spiritual material. The appendix has an overview. Rose named his first book The Albigean Papers, after the Gnostic Cathars, the Albigeans, of 12th century southern France, burned at the stake in the Western world's first genocide, for believing that average men, and shockingly at the time, women, could reach the truth of oneself without the need of a priest or a savior as a go-between. It is likely the Cathars were the last remnant of the ancient Egyptian mystery teachings, direct descendants of the Nag Hammadi Gnostics, and perhaps even held the sacred mystery known metaphorically as the Holy Grail. Their home area of southern France is the focus of my most recent study. Both groups, Gnostic and Cathar, compared reality to a trapping holographic simulation, and that one needed to gather all of one's energy with their inner guide, called a Christ, to break free of it. They both claimed that people in the dream were asleep. Rose called us hypnotized robots, for we believe a false reality. Only by turning away from this false could one begin to see what is not false. Interestingly, I found another modern writer saying similar things, and that was Carlos Castaneda. Castaneda, though presenting his encounters through the interaction with a fictional character, Don Juan, had access to deep teachings on the makeup of reality. Unlike the writers who came after him, who used his basic format to make up a story for themselves to justify their unearned specialness, Castaneda was not following a blueprint, he was creating it. It was the first book that made him famous, The Teachings of Don Juan, which I feel is not only the worst book of the series, I rank it as one of the worst spiritual books ever written. That it is held in such high regard mostly by 1960s drug culture, is a reminder not to blindly follow what the majority believe is good or of value. However, it seems something happened to Castaneda after writing that dissertation. A few years later he published A Separate Reality, Journey to Ixtlan, then Tales of Power, now dropping the need for drugs in the spiritual search. Somehow Castaneda came into the ancient wisdom that he had been pretending to know in his first book. How this occurred, why, or from whom is still unknown. What he did do is take his newfound understanding and fuse it with the format of his first book, his fictional teacher. If one does not take the writings as literal, but as pointers within a novel, the same is found in Moby Dick, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, or Sherlock Holmes, then the value within can be unearthed. Castaneda did not seem that he was able to live what he wrote personally, as his life became quite strange over time. Like many people who touch wisdom, if the egoic structures are not dealt with, they can boomerang back with devastating effects. But his work was a catalyst for me to ask very powerful questions, such as, if the world around me is just the way I think it is, then what would happen to the world if I stopped thinking? Not to have a nice mind, or a happy mind, but no mind. What happened when that occurred will make up a chapter in this book. The more I studied Rose, Castaneda, and ancient manuscripts, the more they strangely confirmed each other and, or at least partially, my own experiences. As such, I felt that my small contribution within this field was to present to those interested how these related sources, separated over thousands of years of time, point to the same subjects, just from slightly different angles. Each was not afraid to discuss as much detail about the dark half of duality as they are the light side. That to me is why their teachings became even more valuable. You can't hide from a part of reality just because you may not like it. There is no coming to consciousness without pain. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own soul. One does not become enlightened merely by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Carl Jung. Part of what has taken me so long to finish this book was not just how to write and present clearly, but also to determine what made it into this book or not. To put in all the details, personal stories, and exercises would have made the book over 500 pages. I had to choose. As such, there became a primer book of around 80 pages, chapters 1 to 4, in which I attempt to present my viewpoint as clearly as I possibly could. Next come 5 later chapters of around 100 pages, which is my attempt to provide a depth to the work. Lastly, in this book is an appendix of useful information that might have disturbed the flow of reading if it were placed in the book proper. It turned out to be about 70 pages. Finally, there are 150 pages that did not make it in this book, which I have collected as an add-on work that can be ordered called additional material. Hence, the story of what you are now holding in your hands and reading. So what's your point with all this? I look over at my editor, now finished reading the first chapter. You know, why did you write this book? My point was to waste your valuable time and keep you stuck on the back porch for the whole afternoon. He frowns in mock disgust. The book comes from years of the search to see just how most of spirituality is, well, not of no value, because there is some, but let's just say very limited value. That the teachings and the teachers are really grade 2 or grade 3, but they pretend and sell like they're at the university level. The spiritual world out there is a kid's game of basic math compared to how the few who have really gone past present it, how the Canyon presented it to me. That modern spirituality and religion are there to keep a hypnotized population hypnotized, not snap them out of it as it claims. So spirituality is just sleepwalking through life? Pretty much. Then what else is there? Going from a sleepwalker to someone who gets tired of the whole movie and theater and popcorn stand, and decides to finally go outside and see what's under the sun. Along the way to do this, we have friends and helpers. But in fact, the only real teacher or helper that we ever learn to trust is ourself. But who exactly is this self that we should learn to trust? What if the self we are listening to is a false self? Then what good is any of the information we get from a self until we understand for sure if it is true or false? I smile. And this is what your book is going to explain? I guess. Slowly. I grab a full bowl that is beside me and offer some to Anders. Want some popcorn? Now it is his turn to smile. If there was one thing I would have added to Chapter 1, I would have said that a seeker of ultimate truth on one level or another is also a seeker of freedom. They have a great desire not just for freedom in their own physical world, but their deepest desire is total freedom. Even though they don't know what total freedom is until they perhaps find it, it is still like a source or a beacon of light that they are following within. This concept of total freedom and the possibility of what it might mean is also a core of this search. Thank you for listening to Chapter 1. The next chapter will be appearing soon. Bye for now.